influence today, all those countries colored green, are either predominantly Islamic or significantly Islamic. There are 57 nations in the Islamic Conference today when all the Muslim countries get together. Now, in contrast, I want to just go back for a moment to the world as it was when some of us here were born, because I want you to see just how different the world is. See, in the late 1940s, this was the world. The British Empire, the United States. Today, look at that. Now, you know, Israel came into existence in 1948. Somebody wrote an article recently in the Washington Post. It was a Jewish writer, but I've forgotten who wrote about how, you know, Jews need to remember that Israel is an accident. In 1947, the United Nations had to vote on what to do with Palestine. And the decision was that the Jews should be given an independent homeland, which they called Israel. And it came into existence 6 months later. But you see, at that particular time in 1947, there were not many Islamic nations. Because most of these Islamic countries you see up there in 1947 were ruled by European powers. It was the end of the colonial period. So Indonesia, for example, which is the world's most populous Muslim state, Indonesia was ruled by Holland until 1949, so it had no vote at the United Nations. India has the second biggest number of Muslims. India had just gotten its independence at the time of that vote, but almost all of these countries here were still ruled by European powers, and all these nations up here were ruled from Moscow, the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union actually wanted Israel to exist because the Jews were predominantly socialists. Remember the kibbutzim in Israel? This was a socialist idea, and Moscow thought that they could get a foothold in the Middle East as a result of Israel coming into existence. If you had a vote today to establish a Jewish nation, you wouldn't get any support. But in 1947, it just got in, before all these nations got their independence. Now, most of these countries here were independent by 1960. Algeria was 62, but most of these countries got their independence between 1945 and 1960. These up here did not get their independence until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. So you see, there has been a dramatic increase in the numbers of Islamic nations. So the power and influence of Islam has grown dramatically in the past 40, 50 years. Even a country like Ethiopia, which, when I was at school was always taught of as we were always taught it was an ancient Christian kingdom. Today, Ethiopia is 50% Muslim. Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world. It is the fastest growing religion in the United States. In the 1970 census, there were 500,000 Muslims in the United States. Today, there are between 8 and 12 million. And, a lot of fuss was made a couple of weeks ago about how the American population just passed the 300 million mark. And there was some gloating over the fact that America's population is growing while Europe's is declining. But what was not pointed out much, I did see it in one newspaper, was that all the growth in the United States in population is basically due to two groups, the Hispanics and Muslims, because they have much bigger families. We've got the same problem really the Europeans have. The Europeans, people of native European descent, are in decline, and more Muslims are moving in. And so you've got significant Muslim populations. France has the biggest Muslim population in the Western world at 10%. But what is interesting is that the kids in school are 30% Muslim. So you see 3 times as many children. So in 1 or 2 generations, you'll have a majority Muslim population in some of these European nations. So there's going to be some serious problems here. Let's just leave that map up there for a moment. I want to read to you some paragraphs from a book called Is This the West's Last Chance? By Tony Blankley, who writes for the Washington Times. And he writes this: in much of the West, and particularly in Europe, there is a blind denial that radical Islam is transforming the world. Most European elites and far too many American politicians and journalists believe that our challenges are business and politics as usual. He writes that King Darius of Persia never imagined, even as he faced Alexander at the Battle of Issus in 333 BC, that within 3 years he would be dead, his dynasty ended, and the great hegemonic Persian Empire crushed as a result of that outnumbered Macedonian upstart, Alexander the Great. American farmers in 1860 never dreamed that within months their husbands, sons and brothers would be killed in battle and that America would be transformed by continental war. And Londoners in the summer of 1939, my parents included, never expected that 40,000 of their fellow Londoners would soon be dead in the streets from German bombing, and that within 5 years Great Britain would never be great again. His point of mentioning that is we just do not realize what we are up against and what the next few years hold in store for us with this problem of Islamic fundamentalism, this resurgent Islamic force which is taking one nation after another. You know, this is the real problem in the Middle East. It's not just Iraq or Afghanistan. It's much bigger than that. It is this Islamic resurgence of radical Islam, which is spreading and is uniting all these different nations in the region. Tony Blankley writes, we need to grasp the idea of discontinuity. The first discontinuity we must recognize is that the mortal threat we face comes not merely from Osama bin Laden and a few thousand terrorists. Rather, we are confronted with the Islamic world, a fifth of mankind, in turmoil, and insurgent as it has not been in at least 500 years, if not 1,500 years. The magnitude of this cultural upheaval cannot yet be measured. Efforts to count the jihadist percentage are pointless, if not dangerously misleading. There is a dynamic process underway that may peter out before it touches 1 in 100 Muslims, or it may impassion a vastly greater number. The latter is more likely. And we are seeing that increasingly. I mean, we saw that in London last year with the bombings on the subway system. You know, the bombers were British-born Muslims who came from affluent backgrounds. You know, none of this idea that all these people are coming from poverty-stricken countries. The terrorists who perpetrated September the 11th in the United States all came from affluent backgrounds. They weren't poor. So poverty is not the cause of this problem. From its inception, I've just got 2 more paragraphs here from Tony Blankley. From its inception, the phrase war on terror has been a deeply flawed description because the danger is more than terrorist attacks and our response has to be greater than preventing terrorist attacks. We are facing a challenge of immigration, cultural aggression and a conflict of values, religions and lifestyles. Professor Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations is a closer approximation of the danger, but even that is insufficient. Professor Huntington, writing in 1994, described a geographic arc of danger from the Middle East to Indonesia. But in today's globalized and interneted world, the forces we must confront are ubiquitous. They are ahead of us, behind us, and within us. Finally, he says, in an odd way, we are in a situation similar to that which confronted the American Indians when European explorers landed on these shores. From North America to South America, the Indians vastly outnumbered the intruders. Had the Europeans been seen as a threat by the Indians could have slaughtered them in short order. Only gradually did the intrusion, driven in part by exploration and a quest for trade, gain in magnitude, change in intent, establish beachheads, and eventually overwhelm the native population. Salman Rushdie, who used to be a Muslim and who